Welcome everyone to today's episode of Soch podcast featuring Girl Up JGU. We're diving deep into a critical topic that has long been sidelined in public discourse, tampon tax, which is also called the pink tax, and the broader politics surrounding menstruation. Half the world bleeds every month. Yet, menstrual hygiene products have historically been taxed as luxury items rather than essentials. Today, we explore how activism, policy change, and persistent social stigma intersect on this issue. Hello, everyone. I'm Anshika from Soch, the Podcast Society, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. I'm joined by my co-moderator Himang Thakur, who's also a part of Soch. Together, we are really excited to lead this conversation as we explore the politics, policy, and lived experiences surrounding menstruation and the tampon tax. Our goal today is to make this not just informative, but a meaningful space for open dialogue. At this moment, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. At first, representing Girl Up JGU, we have Anne George, the General Secretary of the organization. Girl Up JGU is a part of a global movement born out of the United Nations Foundation, dedicated to promoting gender equality, leadership, and awareness through education and grassroots initiatives, and has been at the forefront of student-led advocacy, empowering young voices to challenge stigma and push for a meaningful social change. Joining us from Soch, the Podcast Society, is Kritika Agarwal, the Vice President of the Society. Soch is a creative platform where ideas come alive through dialogue, whether through podcasts, documentaries, or panel discussions. Kritika brings her experience in content creation and youth-focused conversation to drive socially relevant storytelling. We are also joined by Ronak Sinha, a first-year student from JSGP, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, and he's currently pursuing BSc in Economics. Ronak will offer policy and economic perspectives throughout the discussion, particularly on how taxation and affordability and public policy shape menstrual equality in India and globally. And of course, representing our academic and expert panel, we have Professor Preeti Lakhera, Associate Professor and Associate Dean, who specializes in international taxation, corporate law, and international trade law. Her research at the intersection of policy and economic justice gives her a deeper look into why something as technical as taxation has such social implications. Together, our speakers will help us unpack the legal, social, cultural, and economic layers of menstrual equality, going beyond just the removal of tampon tax. Now we're going to start by setting the context. Until 2018, menstrual products in India were taxed under GST at a 12% rate, placing them in the same bracket as luxury goods like chocolates, perfumes, and cosmetics. This classification didn't just show a technical oversight, it exposed a deeper problem, a systemic failure to recognize women's basic health needs. This is something activists around the world have continuously pointed out, that when essential hygiene is treated like a luxury, the system itself is sending a message. So panelists, my first question to all of you would be, considering that menstrual products were once taxed like luxury goods, what do you think this says about our society's valuation of women's health? Should essential hygiene ever be seen as a luxury?
Should I reflect?
Yeah.
So thanks for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here. I think menstruation is a hygiene need, but even if you think about something like basic as food, when it comes to the women in a household, that is comes as a very secondary thing. Because at the end of the day, maintaining menstrual hygiene is a cost for the family unit. And that is why a woman's hygiene needs is going to come next. I'm going to start with my experiences first. That when I started menstruating, it was not pads, it was mostly around cotton and stuff like clothes. And even that used to be a very difficult conversation in the home, that is going to be a very expensive thing to buy. So I think with women it comes certain needs which women identify it more. I think the important issue is what is the cost of the product, and it is going to curtail the budget of the family. So I think these are the ideas that we have to revisit.
Of
Yeah.
course, of course.
Now, Professor gave a very livid reality, I feel. I think my mom actually had a very similar experience regarding the same thing, as far as I've heard the story. And Anshika, I believe that's a really powerful question because it gets right to the heart of gender bias, like how it seeps into our system. Like taxation, as we see, it seems like a very neutral law, right? Like when we read the law, it seems on preface that it's a very neutral law. It is supposed to affect everyone, everybody. But when you bring menstrual products as a taxed good in like 12% GST, as you just said, it and that too equivalent to cosmetics and chocolates, which are at the end of the day an optional good and not a necessity that half of the population in the world is actually facing. So I believe at the end of the day, it does show some sort of deeper problem that exists in the system. Like it is a living reality of half the population. So taxing menstruation in itself, I feel, is grounded on some gender bias that it persists. I think my co-panelists would be able to enunciate better on that. So yeah, what would you guys think about it?
Um, yeah, sure. I think it does represent a very systemic undervaluing of women and gender health, or rather, people that menstruate. Sorry. Um, it it's essentially seen as as Professor said, in a household that's usually where people cut costs, and it shouldn't be, especially because it is a need that like women need every month, right? So it should be recognized that such a structural inequality can be reflected in our laws, in our policy making, and such right to health should then be seen as something that's important and brought into law.
Yeah, definitely, Ashika. I want to focus more on the last part of your question, which was should essential hygiene ever be treated as a luxury, right? And touching more about this, all of us were fortunate enough to be situated in a place where we're pushed forward to think at a global level, right? So thinking globally, of course, one of the most talked about topics in the last few months is the Trump administration. And of course, given ma'am's experience with international taxation as well, I think it's a great time to bring up that why is women's hygiene, at least as far as the Trump administration sees it, not seen as an essential, at least as far as they see, corporate material like steel or chipsets. Because if you see the taxation, which the new tariffs they brought upon China, they accuse China of dumping menstrual hygiene products, essentially selling them at a negative cost to the producers itself, just to harm the U.S. economy. Right. In fact, they charge higher tariff rates on menstrual products than they do on steel, because they consider steel to be more relevant to the economy than menstrual products, which I think makes no sense, right? Sure, you can get the steel, but what's going to make the steel into buildings, into useful stuff? The people of the country. And as we've established multiple times, women make up at least half of the workforce, at least in the US, right? So I think we have to really work on changing the last question. Should essential hygiene ever be treated as a luxury, from why isn't it treated as an absolute necessity?
That is a very, very strong point, Ronak. Like, it's surprising how this tax bracket, which is essentially something that is pretty much technical and neutral, can actually reflect the social bias. Like, when these policymakers treat menstrual hygiene as an optional or maybe like as a non-essential product, it directly affects the women, especially students, I would say, or low-income households and several rural communities as well. So that's a very good insight by all of you. Thank you so much for your viewpoints.
Ma'am, my question to you would be like looking at the global examples, what can India learn from countries that have successfully removed tampon taxes, and how do these movements shape our understanding of menstrual equity?
Okay, So I would, respond that when we decide to, reduce a tax on something or exempt something, so one of the difficult decisions any finance minister is taking is the revenue forward, right? And when we are making that decision, or okay, we are going to forego the revenue, so we are not going to tax this. One of the reasons I think this is not mainstream is because it's a women issue, so we have this understanding the lady will adjust, we will accommodate. That's the issue. So what they're not understanding is that if you're not making this product accessible, right? Accessible like something which you do with an ORS packet, which you consider to be very good for digestive health and to maintain hydration level. So you are basically making women out of the workplace because from those certain days you are embarrassed, you think you will be spotting, you're not able to function properly, and because you have been taught, you will adjust. So I think this is a very, very grave issue which has to be really debated and mainstream. That this is not an issue on which you have to be talking about whether revenue should be foregone or not. The answer should be clear cut that this has to be exempt. There should be no taxation on menstrual hygiene. It's like you should be having a right to have menstrual hygiene.
Absolutely, Professor. The ORS example actually hit us. Rest of the panelists, do you have any concurring opinion with this?
Yeah, definitely. If anything, in fact, I feel menstrual hygiene might even be more basic than ORS, right? Because in a month, you're more like a woman is definitely going to be using more pads than hopefully ORSs, right? Definitely, I agree with ma'am. Tax exemptions, it seems like a very simple solution on the surface. Of course, unfortunately, due to the way policy making is working in our country right now, we're not able to do it, right? And there's multiple reasons for this. For multiple years, it was a taboo to even bring this up at a national stage, right, on the news or whatever. But I'm really happy, and I hope that in the next decade, hopefully, we see major changes towards this, right? And apart from that, even the production side of it, hopefully more subsidies for efficient machines which are able to output this for good social causes as well.
So the second part, because I think most people have answered the tax question, I'll just answer the menstrual equity part. So countries that have removed the tampon tax haven't just removed the tampon tax, right? They've also gone ahead and they've worked on distribution, they've worked on destigmatization, they've worked on essentially educating the population to remove the idea that if this is something that someone can control, right? And if we're not, it's a medicine to people. And if we're not going to be taxing our medicines, then why are we taxing our tampons essentially? So I think that's what's really important to get to menstrual equity.
I think I agree with you on so much level. Like, just giving, like, I believe Scotland made menstrual products free for all of the population in 2020, right? So, I believe that's a great initiative at the end of the day. But just giving menstrual pads or just doing a one-time solution is not enough. It's a progressive thing. You have to look at the end. You have to look for the generations to come. So menstrual equity doesn't stop at the fact that you provided certain pads, certain menstrual hygiene, certain knowledge to certain group of people in certain villages. What you need to think about is mass impact. And if I talk about India in general, I think the point starts with destigmatization that is very much needed. The whole idea of stigma pulls people back to the primitive thinking of oh, menstruation is related to so many bad domains, which doesn't allow equity to prosper at all, let alone come in the whole discussion. So I think not just about making policies with regards to let's do this thing for improved menstrual hygiene. They should also work on the idea of promoting that oh, you bleeding is not bad. People who menstruate, there's no issue with that. Like it's a very normal bodily function. That until it's normalized, and if they keep glorifying the discussion, it will never reach to the idea of equity because you need to have something normalized to reach the idea of equity and not glorify it. So that would be my opinion on this.
Like such points and discussion bring out that how such a basic hygiene is been treated with so much stigmatization and taboo, regardless of the fact that a similar product is being like treated away as a simple medicine. But just as Professor Preeti said, that people would often hesitate to like approach certain medical shops just because of that product's nature, which is like so bad to all extent. If I'm correct,
Yeah, sorry to interject. The infamous black panni over the.
Yeah.
that's like
I actually relate to that a lot. It has happened with me several times. Like whensoever you go to a pharmacy and you ask for any such products, pads essentially, tampons, etc., they always give it to you in a black panni.
Right.
Now I don't understand what this taboo is. Why can I not just carry a whispered pad and just like walk out? Why is the newspaper packing or the panni that essential? And it's not just the pharmacy bhaiya giving this. It's also that at times women ask for this themselves because they feel like they cannot carry that particular product straight up. They need some sort of covering. So this taboo I feel is one thing which essentially needs to be talked about. So thank you so much for this insightful discussion. I just remembered like in India there were campaigns like Laghu Ka Lagan, which was the tax on blood, and that went viral on like several social media platforms. Activists had sent pads covered in protest slogans to authorities, created petitions, and used social media to mobilize thousands. These symbolic protests also forced a national conversation actually that the government could no longer ignore. Which brings me to my third question. Can you elaborate on how these protests, which could be like both street demonstrations and online movements in fact, actually influence the policy? Do these symbolic acts like sending sanitary pads with protest messages can really create a tangible change in the society?
I think definitely they can, because I think every law, every regulation was once an idea which came into somebody's mind.
Yeah.
Somebody, sat in a fireside chat, or that started a conversation, that started a movement, that's mainstream something, and then it converts into a law or a regulation or an act. Definitely, I think, and I think in today's time, for the current generation, visibility and conversations, they definitely matter a lot. And we have so many platforms where you can easily disseminate the idea. So you're not waiting for very slow dissemination of the ideas across, you can say, different spaces. You can generate conversations at a very, very fast paced manner. So I think definitely these things are good and they should be done. And I think I also wanted to mention, because I was listening to the conversation, that how things have changed. Look at the marketing. Earlier, when you used to have menstrual advertisement, they will have that blue ink on the sanitary pad. But now they have the red ink. So I think we also have started, learning through the advertisement that the generation they doesn't want to be done in a euphemistic manner. So we are opening that it is part of our hygiene. So when in a shaving campaign, you can show somebody that's shaving a beard or soap is being used to wash your hands. So why can't you just show blood in a menstrual, pad? I think so. Definitely those conversations should be started, and this is a great initiative.
I love the answer, I'm not gonna lie. This was a very different like way to answer and I just loved it. Thank you so much for that.
but that is true. Like today we have seen that they are using red ink.
Yeah.
Thankfully, tomorrow they will stop using the black basket pen
Exactly, exactly.
because and Professor, I believe all the panelists can concur with me that how ironic it is that the society, whenever there is a issue and whenever there is a conflict, the society will throw black ink on people's face, and when it's time for medicine, they will use the same color to hide it. So it is pretty ironic on this.
But I think that's a cultural thing. There are
That is-
cultures where black is considered to be a good color. So I think it's a cultural thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So black is not a bad color. It makes you slim and
Even the campaigns like Laghu Ka Lagan were need to tell you that you don't bleed blue. Like as Professor said, I mean even I used to growing up like find it so like what exactly happened was like half of the time I didn't used to even understand the ad that was being advertised because the whole fight there was a blue. I'm like how the thing is working I don't know. But then again I'm really glad that we are progressive in a good way. It's a progressive development and that should be some of a consonance to us I think. But at the end of the day, when I talk about protests, I think we are moving into a very like digital age where like AI is just raging, and people are online chronically. Good or bad, that is a discussion for another day. But I think online being present helps in a lot of protests. Like I personally get to know about a lot of things that are happening around the world through Instagram, through updates, through every other social app there is. While I'm not saying I'm very chronically that way, but like chronically online that way, but what I'm trying to say is that you cannot deny the fact that online protests shape people's view in a lot of circumstances. Earlier, when the unity used to come, it used to come on physical discussions, like people are being present physically at certain point, newspaper discourses, etc. But now with everything being turned online, I think the news is reaching faster to everyone everywhere throughout the world. Something that is happening in one part of the world is reaching us, reaching let's say every northern southern country that there are. So I think protest is definitely making a big tangible difference, which is a great initiative that should have happened, and I'm very happy it's happening.
I just want to add one point. I think it's really important to protest so that policymakers are aware that there are people that are being affected by laws and their policies. And I think that's the one of the most important parts of a protest. But other than that, I think everything really.
Yeah, again, not to disagree with any of the other panelists here, but and again, I completely agree with their points that protests definitely bring a lot of public attention, especially in today's online age, to issues, right? However, I am always slightly against the protest because unfortunately we're still, I would say, in sort of a backward society in the sense that people will protest on anything.
Yeah.
Right? They don't like something in a movie, they'll protest, they'll burn the actress's face on like a hey statue, right? And if not, if the brilliant movies come out, they'll drop 50 liters of milk on a massive poster of the hero. So I do think like while the protest has definitely had gained traction and did bring real change, I do still definitely think maybe 1,000 pads sent to the finance ministry would have made 1,000 people's day much more comfortable, at least across the country. I do completely understand why the protest was very much required. It still should have happened, and I understand it sent a very strong message to the people in charge that hey, we need this to happen. But again, I think unfortunately a lot of protests end up getting muddled because of essentially, right, so much stupid stuff happens around important things, right? It drowns out what's really important, which I think we can prevent with more direct, I don't know how you can get more direct than this, but more direct ways of doing it, especially being online now helps definitely much more compared to at least 8 years ago when this entire thing happened.
I think I agree with him on a lot of points. The protest in essence is important because it helps change our current laws, right? If people do not protest, people do not throughout century, throughout the course of history, protests have bring discussions that have been that have been like pushed down by other noises that have been present. So it's true that there are a lot of noises, but then again, you cannot have a clean protest. That's also a practicality of thing that we have to consider. As much as of a utopia it might sound to have like a discussion without any noise. I think noise in itself could be a very subjective thing because what we may be calling a noise would be a crying voice for someone who's actually being affected in a different way by the same issue. So I think that's there, but I do agree in certain points that due to so many other small themes that are present, the main agenda of an issue in a protest sometimes does get debarred because of so much multiple conversations that are going. So I think that's a very great point of view to have.
I think with regards to all this, sometimes what essentially happens is that a symbolic act, like a protest maybe, can shake the system far more powerfully than mere numbers or reports. Now, when young people like students or people in general and several grassroots organizations, when they make the issue impossible to be ignored, policymakers finally act on it. Now, it of course showcases that public pressure works, especially when they are backed by storytelling, emotional approach, and solidarity. So that was a great approach by all of you.
This is my following question. Tax removal alone doesn't solve the main issue of accessibility. Like people have accessibility of cultural, social, and logistical, which affects people's ability to access menstrual products. So, according to you, how can these barriers can be removed as a whole, or like not, because we know removing barriers is a big thing, but how can we at least create a hole in those barriers, which makes people's approach much easier in accessing these products.
I think there are two issues here. One is when we talk about excess, one is that I have the money to buy it. So then when I have the money to buy it, I'm dependent on the person who is financing the budget of the family. So there I really like the, social messaging of the Akshay Kumar advertisement where you are telling owner of the family that why don't you go and buy pads for your wife instead of buying cigarettes. One is that. The other accessibility issue is you have the money, like maybe for example in our campus, but sometimes people think, oh, I'm so embarrassed to go and buy a pad. How can I go openly and buy a pad? I think so different solutions for different accessibility issues. For those sort of strata who are controlling the budget of the family, so obviously we can do a social messaging, we can mainstream that this is also to be a very essential thing for a woman to have. For the second type of access, I think we can have like information dissemination. For example, when I was listening to this conversation, what was coming to my mind is it's like having posters where you're just using cartoons and a person is telling the person, okay, I'm going to go and change my pad, or I'm just going to go and buy the sanitary pad. So that sort of social messaging where it is very comfortable for you to have those conversations, and that's why I think that access conversation is going to begin. But yes, it's an important thing which we have to start mainstreaming and talking about.
Professor, absolutely I agree with your point, but just a small follow-up question, if it's okay with you. Despite the campaigning messages, we still see that majority of our country, if I talk about our country or only, majority of people still have the accessibility problems, and not only just in rural places, but in urban places too. And this problem is still prevalent in today's generation. So, like accessibility, the two solutions you propose are extremely efficient. But like, what other things which we can do to like minimize these barriers?
I think the only thing which can happen is uh, social messaging, because I think this is a problem which is happening at the unit of the family level, right? So it's like if you want to change something, you have to enter that family system. You have to talk to the elders in the family, or you have to talk to the people who are grooming the next generation. So sometimes, for example, there are people who join formal educational institutions and they get access to these ideas. And over there, for example, just like me, they unlearn to be embarrassed about it, to be conscious about it.
I think Professor has majorly covered with most of the points that he would like to say, but adding on to one thing, I think the idea of having sex education in high schools and all levels of school, basically in predominantly high school, when women actually start menstruating, having first of all, having the discussion of sexual education in itself is not present in like majority of schools. But even if we go into that, having discussion of menstruation is even less. I remember when I was in school, the only menstruation discussion I had was in my biology book, 8th grade, and that was it. There was no practical discussion on things in classroom cohort that okay, what are the things that happen, what do not happen, and I think for a 13 or 14-year-olds, or like around those age when people who menstruate are there, I think it's important to understand that such discourses are really important because these are the building age when they have to practically understand what they're going through. As menstruation could even be mentally taxing for like starting out in that particular age, and I think that's really important that even the idea of accessibility, the education in itself, which should be accessible to all, does not cover that forefront.
I think the whole like affordability and stigma has already been covered. So I'll just talk about how the lack of infrastructure is something that's really important. Like even on campus, to get it into washrooms took a really long time, right? And like our council and last income. So they did a lot of work. But if a place that is considered as modern as campus is took so long for it to come to washrooms, then it is in rural areas that safe disposal containers, disposal mechanisms are so few and far between that is something that needs to like change along with destigmatization and affordability.
Yeah, I think definitely everyone has just covered a lot of the stuff. So I just want to touch upon one thing, right? We as society, our job is to make sure there's all the possible avenues available for people to menstruate, all the possible products. But I think it's something we all can understand. If there are some people, maybe younger people who just started to menstruate, who still may be slightly embarrassed by it, right? And I think in that specific domain and field, I think quick commerce like Zepto, Blinkit, Instamart, which can get it to your homes in 15-20 minutes, have really helped, right? Not just with menstrual hygiene products, but with all sexual wellness products. If confidentiality, quick delivery, and as I said earlier, our objective as society is to make sure no one is forced to be embarrassed when purchasing a product like this, right? But then everyone has their own personal views, personal opinions, and you can't go and change everyone, right? But I think these quick commerce things, or at least stuff which you can get necessities to you fast, really helps access for people, right? Even in emergencies where you may not know you need a pad or a tampon with you at all times, you can get it within the next half an hour, nearly anywhere in the country at this state.
That was a very, very great insight into the discussion. I think summing up all this, there is one realization I've had, and that is that definitely policies can do a lot. They can bring about a lot of change. But change is something that often starts from our very homes. Like when our fathers, brothers, teachers, mothers, when they create open conversations about such delicate topics, is when stigma tends to break faster. So I think from this whole panel discussion, the one thing I've learned is certainly that even mini changes in the way you think, in the way you acknowledge, in the way you treat, can bring about huge changes in the society. And like one by one, if people tend to incorporate these changes in the way they think or the way they act, can definitely create maybe a beautiful society for a lot of women to live in. So yeah, that was great, honestly, for me. The discussion was genuinely great.
It was great. Yeah, and I am very thankful for engaging me with this conversation. I really enjoyed myself a lot. It was very thoughtful.
Likewise, Professor.
Yeah, I just
Thanks a
feel
lot. Thank you.
I just feel it was a great discussion, and this conversation certainly went beyond tax and economics, and we directly linked it to health, dignity, and rights. Now, I think this is the point when we intersect policy, activism, technology, and empathy, and this should be treated as an important part of our life. So honestly, thank you to all the panelists and listeners, all of you, for joining us today in this journey. And this fight for menstrual equity does continue, and I think every voice matters. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.